So far, this inquiry hadn't got near answering the central question. How come we went to war with Iraq when we did? Indeed, yesterday and the day before, we heard from senior civil servants that Iraq wasn't considered the most dangerous nation, nor was there compelling new intelligence against her. But today we heard an extraordinary account of just how and why we went to war from someone right at the heart of US-British relations.
Anyway, it's really nice to hear.
Christopher Mayer first met Tony Blair way back in 1993. 4 years later, the new Prime Minister Blair appointed him UK ambassador to the US, a post he retained until 2003. Giving evidence today, Sir Christopher says that the fundamental change in the run-up to the war with Iraq was the American attitude post 9/11. In April 2002, Tony Blair travelled to President Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas, and was, believes his former ambassador, convinced of the need for regime change.
I know what the Cabinet Office says were the results of the meeting, but to this day I'm not entirely clear what degree of convergence was, if you like, signed in blood at the Crawford ranch.
At the time, the loyal ambassador repeated the party line.
It was never going to be a council of war. No decisions have been taken, and nothing of a military kind is imminent.
For example, at Crawford.
But now, speaking more candidly, Sir Christopher says there was clear evidence of a new Blair mindset. In a speech the Prime Minister gave the very next day after the Crawford meeting, he spoke of regime change for the first time.
If necessary, the action should be military. And again, if necessary and justified, it should involve regime change.
When I heard that speech, I thought that this represents a tightening of the UK-US alliance and a degree of convergence on the danger that Saddam Hussein presented.
But here, Sir Christopher says, Britain was taken for granted in that alliance. Insufficient conditions were placed on Britain's support for regime change in Iraq.
If, for example, at Crawford, Tony Blair had said, I want to help you, George, on this, but I have to say to you in all honesty that I will not be able to take part in any military operation unless we have palpable progress on the Middle East process and we have absolute clarity about what happens in Iraq if it comes to our removing Saddam Hussein. I think that would have changed the nature. It wouldn't have led to a rupture, I think, but it would have changed the nature, I think, of American planning.
On this point, Sir Christopher was implicitly extremely critical of Tony Blair. It was down to him, he suggested, that Britain's support for America was taken as an unconditional given. And just in case we didn't get this message clearly enough, Sir Christopher invited us to imagine what would have happened if another politician had been in charge.
Quite often I think about this, I think, what would Margaret Thatcher have done? And she would have insisted on a clear... I take her name in vain, for Pete's sake. I may be hit with a thunderbolt, but I think she would have insisted on a clear, coherent political diplomatic strategy, and I think she would have demanded the greatest clarity about what the heck happened if and when we removed Saddam Hussein.
Tony Blair, though, is often credited with persuading George Bush to at least try to get UN authorization for action. Actually, says Sir Christopher, this was more down to Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. But in November 2002, a tough new UN resolution 1441 was passed, imposing a new weapons inspection regime under Hans Blix. However, Sir Christopher says there was no time to let the inspectors finish their work. The US military was, by then, driving the timetable. Conflict was set for March 2003.
It was impossible to see how Blix could bring the inspection process to a conclusion, for better or for worse, by March. And suddenly, as a matter, because of that, the unforgiving nature of the military timetable, we found ourselves scrabbling for the smoking gun, which was another way of saying, it's not that Saddam now has to prove he's innocent. We've now bloody well got to try and prove he's guilty. And we, the Americans, British, have never really recovered from that, because, of course, there was no smoking gun.
However interesting, Sir Christopher's evidence has not uncovered the smoking gun of this Iraq inquiry. There is, though, plenty of time and plenty more witnesses for one to emerge.
David Grossman, and I'm joined now by Lord Fuchs, who was a former government minister under Tony Blair, and Karen Ross, the UK's former Iraq expert at the United Nations. Lord Fuchs, what do you make of this central allegation that the Blair government decided to go to war and then try to find a justification for it, which was, of course, exactly the opposite of everything we've been told?
You know, that was an astonishing testimony today. It's confirmed all my fears about this Iraq inquiry. It was a combination of hearsay, of gossip, of opinion, of tittle-tattle. And I fear if we're going to get this kind of thing day in, day out, with people jumping to conclusions and debates taking place every night on one little piece of evidence, so-called evidence, it wasn't evidence at all, then we're never going to get any coherent discussions
Wouldn't the British ambassador to the United States, knighted for his services to this country, know what was going on?
But do you notice at the time he said something entirely different from now? He wasn't in that meeting. He doesn't know what went on in that meeting. And then he goes on to say that something Tony Blair said in the speech a day later was evidence of what was decided in that meeting. He should realise, he must know that these speeches are written or drafted in London many days, sometimes weeks beforehand. It really was quite nonsensical. And I'm afraid if we're going to get a procession of prima donnas and the usual suspects grandstanding for the TV, this inquiry is going to become a farce.
Let me bring in Karen Ross, because, I mean, one thing is certain, and Sir Christopher Mayer accepted it, he wasn't there at the meeting in Crawford, Texas. We do not know what George Bush and Tony Blair talked about. They're the only two who do.
No, we're dying to find out. I mean, we must wait for Tony Blair's testimony, hopefully, to find that out at that point. But I think what is clear is that the facts of Iraq, of weapons inspections, of the alleged threat, the inquiry has already established that. Several officials have now already testified, as I testified to the Butler inquiry, that the British government did not believe that Iraq constituted a threat, that there was no substantial evidence of weapons of mass destruction, of a threat to other countries, let alone the UK. And that is now established by the inquiry. And I think that really undermines those who claim that this inquiry is just replaying rumour or tittle-tattle. I think this is fundamental.
Lord Fuchs?
But this inquiry is going into much wider things than that. And I hope we won't just get a procession of the usual suspects, you know, relatives of those people who sadly died during it, and people who've been critical of Tony Blair. It must not become a sort of inquisition about Tony Blair, a sort of Star Chamber court about Tony Blair. It needs to look at lessons that can be learned. And I've written to Sir John Chilcot, suggesting, for example, that Anne Clwyd should be brought before the inquiry, that Emma Nicholson should be brought before the inquiry.
Both MPs who studied the inhumanity of Saddam Hussein.
Absolutely, because I remember, Gavin, year after year after year, we had deputations in the House of Commons from the Kurds, from the Marsh Arabs, saying, please do something to help us. And we felt completely impotent.
Maybe Chilcot will hear from them. But Karen Ross, on this other point made today by the ambassador, making comparisons with Margaret Thatcher, I mean, again, the implication of this is really serious, that, in effect, he is suggesting Tony Blair did not protect the British national interest. Karen Ross.
That's rubbish.
Well, my impression very much throughout the years that I worked on Iraq and attended UK-US bilateral talks on Iraq was that we were very much responding to an American agenda. They would say to us how they wanted to play the policy, and we would respond and try to modulate their intentions to the wider world.
Karen Ross, it's perfectly possible that British national interests and American national interests on an issue like this are identical.
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely, of course. I don't dispute that. But I think what is at issue here is the arguments that were used publicly to sell the war. The Americans, I think, said to the UK, and I think they made this pretty clear to us in talks I attended too, was that they were going to get rid of Saddam in any case, that they were determined to do it after 9/11. He was a bad man and a danger to the world, and he should be got rid of. The Brits said to him, we can't do this without legal authority. We have to get the inspectors back in order to create a casus belli, a trigger. We can assume that Saddam will not cooperate with the inspectors, as he's done many times in the past, and that will give us the argument to go back to the Security Council and get legal authorisation. That didn't happen. The British strategy was a failure.
Lord